peaceful protests calling for more transparency in the Nolan Wells investigation was evening in Mississippi. The parents are seeking answers about what led to the death of their son. Wells' body was found after a 4th of July boat trip with friends to Horn Island in Mississippi. The death has sparked speculation after his friends returned from the trip without him. Patrick Wright reports.
I feel like today's testament is that we want answers. It's not about vengeance. It's not about accusations. It's about the truth, and it's about transparency.
We're going to stand behind the family, and that's why we're out here.
No peace!
A lot of times, these stories go unnoticed.
Because Nolan Wells is not the only one. There has been a long historic string of young black men losing their life under very suspicious circumstances.
I am the family of Emmett Till, and my family is here in support of what's going on because this young man should not be dead.
No justice! No peace!
So I know him personally as a kid before he went out to college. It's hard in this generation to find kids that still say yes sir, no sir.
A former judge just said, on camera, under his own name, that if this case had landed on his desk while he was still on the bench, he would have already signed an arrest warrant. Not for murder. Not yet. For something smaller. Something you can actually prove right now, today, without waiting on a single lab result. A phone. Nolan Wells' phone. Stay with me on this, because this is the part almost nobody is talking about correctly. While hundreds of people were standing on a street corner in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, holding signs and saying one name over and over, a different kind of pressure was building somewhere else entirely. In a Facebook video that ran for more than 30 minutes, from a man who spent over 6 years on the bench signing exactly the kind of warrants he says should already exist in this case. His name is Carlos Moore. And before you decide what to make of him, I need you to know exactly who he is, exactly what he's claiming, and, just as important, exactly where his legal argument ends and his personal speculation begins. Because in this case, more than almost any other we've covered on this channel, that line matters. It matters for Nolan. It matters for his family. And it matters for the people whose names are being said in connection with this case who have not been charged with anything. So here's where we're going today. We're starting with the ground truth, what actually happened on that street corner over the weekend, in the words of the people who showed up. Then we're going to walk through what officials have actually confirmed, no more, no less. And then we're going to spend real time with Carlos Moore's argument, because it is detailed, it is credentialed, and parts of it are genuinely compelling. But other parts of it are something else entirely, and I am not going to blur that line for you, even where it would make for a punchier story. If you're new here, that's the whole reason this channel exists. We separate what's confirmed from what's alleged. We use the words accused and suspect the way they're supposed to be used, not as a formality, but because those words carry real legal weight, and someone's life can turn on whether we get that right. So if that's the kind of true crime coverage you're looking for, stay with me and hit subscribe before we get into it, because this case is moving fast and there is going to be more to follow. Let's start with Saturday evening at the corner of Government and State Streets. Before we get to the crowd and before we get to Carlos Moore, let's ground ourselves in what this case is actually about, because it's easy to lose track of that once the legal analysis starts. Nolan Wells was a young man who, by every account we've heard from people who actually knew him, was headed to college and was well liked by the people around him. He went on a 4th of July boat trip out to Horn Island, Mississippi, with a group of friends. Somewhere in the course of that day, something happened. His friends came back from the island without him. His body was later found. That is the entire confirmed shape of this case at its most basic level. Everything past that, how he died, why his friends returned without him, what happened on that island, is still being investigated. It has not been resolved. No one has been charged. And that last sentence is going to matter over and over again as we move through this episode, because a lot of what you're about to hear involves people forming strong opinions about what they believe happened, without that formal resolution ever having arrived. His mother's name is Christine, and she has become one of the most visible public voices in this case, which is worth noting up front because it shapes almost everything that happened over that weekend, including the protest itself. The day before hundreds of people gathered on that street corner, Christine held a press conference of her own, and what she said there matters, because it set the tone for almost everything that followed. She asked people to keep things peaceful. She specifically said that Nolan wasn't someone who liked fights, that he didn't even really like arguments, and she asked people not to go out there trying to be tough. She asked them instead to think about what Nolan himself would have wanted, and she said plainly that he would not have wanted that kind of behavior from the people showing up in his name. That's a striking thing for a grieving mother to say publicly, 24 hours before hundreds of strangers were about to gather in her son's name. She wasn't asking for restraint because she didn't feel anger or grief. By every reasonable account, she felt both intensely. She was asking for restraint because she understood, correctly, that how this protest was conducted would shape how the entire case was perceived going forward. And by every account of what actually happened the next evening, that's exactly what people gave her. Saturday evening, the corner of Government and State Streets in downtown Ocean Springs filled with people. Some reports put the number above 100. Others described it as several hundred. Either way, and this is worth sitting with for a second, this was not a small gathering of immediate family and close friends. This was something much larger, and it was sustained. People held signs. They prayed together. A group known as Israel United in Christ marched past the intersection and down Government Street before folding back into the larger crowd. By every account available, the evening stayed peaceful from start to finish, exactly as Christine had asked. What's genuinely striking about this crowd, if you actually listen to who showed up and why, is the range of it. This wasn't one demographic. This was a cross-generational crowd, teenagers standing next to grandparents, people who had never met Nolan personally, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had known him his entire life. And I think that range says something important about how this story has traveled. A death that started as one family's private tragedy has become something an entire region feels it has some stake in, some responsibility toward. Let's actually hear from some of the people who were there, because their reasons for showing up varied more than you might expect. A 19-year-old named Nicholas Madison said his goal for the day was simple: make sure people said Nolan's name. He talked about young people specifically needing to show up to events like this one, describing them as the backbone of the community's ability to actually push for change. Older residents came out too. Quanta Green, who described herself as a mother of 2 sons, said this case hit close to home for her personally. She said she came out specifically to support the family and to let them know the community stood behind them. A resident named Gordon Jackson made a related point from a different angle. He said Nolan Wells could easily have been his own grandson. And then he connected this specific case to something much larger, what he called a long, historic pattern of young black men losing their lives under suspicious circumstances. That framing came up more than once that evening, and it's worth naming directly rather than glossing over, because it's clearly part of why this case has resonated so far beyond Nolan's immediate circle. Another attendee, Arthemius Walker, framed his reason for showing up around unity. He said he wanted to see the community come together with real cohesiveness, with a shared understanding of what's actually going on. But I think the most personal account of the night came from a local resident named Jiren Lowry. Jiren Lowry didn't come to this protest as a stranger paying his respects. He came with an actual history with Nolan that stretched back years. Lowry's daughter played basketball with Nolan when they were kids. Later, as Nolan got older, he actually worked for Lowry's business, renting out water slides and bounce houses. Lowry remembered the exact conversation Nolan had with him when he first came looking for that job. Nolan told him his parents had said he needed to earn his own money, and Lowry remembered telling him, in return, that he wanted Nolan to make good choices once he got to college, to actually set himself up for a real future. Nolan's response, according to Lowry, was simply, "Yes, sir." Lowry said that kind of respect is rare to find in kids today, and that it reflected directly on how Nolan's parents raised him. But here's the part of what Lowry said that I think deserves the most attention, because it cuts directly against the way this case sometimes gets flattened online. Lowry was explicit that he doesn't believe this is about the color of anyone's skin. He said plainly that it's about the facts, whatever those facts turn out to be. And he said something genuinely rare in a moment like this. If what happened to Nolan turns out to have been a mistake, an accident, something without malicious intent behind it, then people need to be willing to say that honestly and talk about it. What he said he wants more than anything, more than a particular outcome, is for the truth to actually come out. He closed his remarks with a message directly to Nolan, wishing him rest, and telling him he'd done everything he could while he was here, and that he'd done a good job of it. I wanted to give Lowry's account real space in this episode, because I think it represents something important, a demand for truth that isn't the same thing as a demand for a predetermined conclusion. That distinction is going to come up again when we get to Carlos Moore, because it's the exact same distinction his commentary sometimes honors and sometimes blurs. Now let's step completely out of the emotional register of that protest for a moment, because this next part is where a lot of public conversation about this case has gone sideways, and I want to be precise about it. On that exact same weekend the protest took place, the Jackson County coroner confirmed that the physical examination of Nolan's body had been completed the previous Tuesday. At that stage, the coroner said no preliminary indications of foul play had been found. But, and this is the part that gets dropped constantly in online conversation, the coroner was also clear that the complete final autopsy, including toxicology, had not yet been released, and officials at the time said those results were expected sometime the following week. Let that timing sink in for a second. The protest wasn't happening in response to a confirmed finding that Nolan's death was an accident. It was happening squarely in the middle of an acknowledged gap, after a preliminary look found nothing immediately obvious, but before the full, final picture had actually come together. That distinction between a preliminary finding and a completed final finding is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost the fastest in public conversation about a case like this. And it's a huge part of why so many people at that protest felt there was still real reason to keep pushing rather than treating an early, partial read as the end of the story. Here's why that distinction actually matters medically, not just legally. A preliminary examination and a full forensic autopsy are looking for genuinely different things. A preliminary look can rule out the most obvious, visible signs of trauma, gunshot wounds, stab wounds, severe blunt force injury. What it cannot rule out are more subtle findings, the kinds of things toxicology and a more detailed internal examination are specifically designed to catch. So even a completely accurate statement that no immediate signs of foul play were found still leaves an enormous amount of ground uncovered. That's exactly the ground both the state autopsy and the independent one are meant to cover once they're actually finished. I want to underline that last point because it's going to become the single most important thread running through the rest of this episode. As of right now, neither the state autopsy nor the independent autopsy has been publicly released. Every piece of legal analysis you're about to hear from Carlos Moore is built on top of that unresolved gap. Around this same period, a very different kind of voice entered the public conversation around this case. Carlos Moore is a former municipal court judge in Mississippi who now practices law out of Atlanta. Moore has said he served on the bench for a little over 6 years. He's also said publicly, and this is his own account, worth stating as exactly that he was ultimately pushed off that bench after speaking out against racial discrimination on social media while he was still serving as a sitting judge. He took to Facebook for over 30 minutes, and he framed his commentary explicitly around his own professional background from the very start. He said he spent nearly a quarter century in the legal field, and that during his time on the bench, he personally signed search warrants and arrest warrants in more than one Mississippi jurisdiction. I want to pause on why that framing actually matters, rather than just noting it and moving on. Moore isn't speaking as an outside commentator guessing at how the system theoretically works. He's speaking as someone who used to be the actual person on the other side of that desk, the one deciding whether an affidavit was strong enough to sign off on. That's a meaningfully different vantage point than most of the true crime commentary you'll find online about this case, and it's part of why his argument deserves to be taken seriously as legal analysis. At the same time, it's worth being honest about the other side of his profile. Moore isn't a stranger to speaking publicly on cases involving race and the justice system in Mississippi. And his own account of being pushed off the bench after criticizing racial discrimination while still serving is part of why his commentary here carries a particular kind of weight, and, frankly, a particular kind of risk to him personally. He's speaking with the authority of someone who understands these mechanics from the inside. He's also speaking as someone who has already experienced professional consequences for speaking out publicly before, which tells you something about how seriously he takes the decision to do it again here. With all of that as context, let's actually get into what he said, starting with the single most concrete, most legally grounded argument in his entire 30-minute commentary. Moore's clearest, most concrete legal argument in this entire case is not about how Nolan died. It's about a phone. There is video that circulated widely showing a moment where a voice widely believed to be Nolan's can reportedly be heard demanding his phone back. Moore's reasoning from there is straightforward, almost stripped down on purpose. If Nolan, in his own words, while he was still alive, did not give whoever had that phone permission to keep it, and that person kept it anyway, that is potentially theft. Full stop. Moore said plainly that if an affidavit reflecting exactly that scenario had been presented to him while he was still a sitting judge, he would have signed an arrest warrant for theft of the phone, based entirely on what's already been described publicly. And he made a point of separating this from the larger, far more serious question hanging over the entire case. He said this doesn't require solving how Nolan died. It's a much narrower, much more immediately provable question. Who had possession of that phone without permission, and why? Moore drew what I think is a genuinely useful distinction here between the largest possible charge a case like this could eventually produce and the smallest, most immediately provable one sitting right in front of investigators. In his words, investigators sometimes get so focused on trying to build toward the biggest possible outcome, in this case, potentially a murder charge, that they overlook smaller, more straightforward violations that are already fully supported by evidence that's public right now. In his view, the theft question doesn't require waiting on any autopsy result at all. It's a question that could theoretically be resolved today based on witness accounts and video that already exist. I want to flag something important here before we move on. This argument is Moore's legal opinion, offered publicly and under his own name and credentials. It is not a criminal charge. No one has been arrested for theft or for anything else in connection with this case as of this episode. What Moore is describing is what he believes the evidence could support, not what has actually happened procedurally. That distinction is easy to lose in the retelling, so I wanted to state it plainly here rather than let it blur. Beyond the phone, Moore's broader argument is really about pace, about whether this investigation is moving with the urgency he believes a case like this demands. He said that nearly a week after Nolan was first reported missing, there should already be search warrants on file, evidence formally submitted to a judge, and subpoenas issued for the social media accounts belonging to the friends who were with Nolan that day. He said the young men involved should have already been formally questioned by investigators, not simply approached informally. To his credit, Moore was careful to frame this as his understanding of standard procedure in a serious investigation, rather than something he was simply guessing at. In his words, this is what the process usually looks like when a thorough investigation is actually underway. Moore also directly criticized language used by the sheriff's office early in this case. He said he disagrees with the decision to state publicly that no foul play is suspected. In his view, a more appropriate and more accurate statement at that stage would have been that it's simply too early to say either way. He argued that specific choice of words shapes how seriously the public perceives the investigation, and that, in his assessment, the surrounding circumstances of this case don't support that level of early certainty. Then Moore laid out a list of behaviors that, taken together, he considers suspicious enough to warrant formally treating the friend group as suspects rather than persons of interest. He pointed to reports that the friends were seen having breakfast together the next morning rather than actively searching for Nolan. He pointed to reports of deleted and deactivated social media accounts. He pointed to an episode involving car keys, where one of the young men reportedly said he couldn't find them, only for them to turn up shortly after. And he pointed to reports that legal representation was secured very early, before Nolan's body had even been recovered. I want to be precise about how to actually hold this part of his commentary. Every individual detail Moore lists here has been separately reported elsewhere, and we've touched on several of them in earlier coverage on this channel. What's different here is Moore's own interpretation, his opinion that these details, stacked together, cross a threshold from unusual behavior into something that should formally change how these young men are classified within the investigation. That interpretation is exactly that, his legal opinion. It is not a finding from any judge, prosecutor, or investigator with actual authority over this case, and as of this episode, none of these individuals have been named as suspects by law enforcement or charged with any crime. And then there's the part of Moore's commentary that requires, in my view, the most caution of anything in this entire episode. At one point, Moore raised a question about one of the mothers connected to this case, referencing a public post in which she said she had gone out to the island herself at some point. Moore openly speculated about her reasons for being there, and he used a specific and serious legal term, accessory, in connection with her, while explicitly framing it as his own curiosity rather than a claim he could actually support with evidence. I want to be direct with you about why we're handling this part the way we are. Wondering aloud whether someone might be an accessory to a crime without any supporting evidence behind it is a serious accusation, even when it's dressed up as a question instead of a statement. We are choosing not to identify which specific person Moore was referring to, because doing so would mean amplifying an unproven, serious allegation against a private individual who has not been charged with anything in this case. Moore is entitled to raise questions publicly under his own name, and he's clearly aware of the professional risk that carries. But raising a question is not the same thing as establishing a fact, and that distinction matters more in this specific moment than anywhere else in his entire commentary. To his credit, and it's worth stating this clearly rather than only cataloging the parts of his commentary that overreach, Moore was consistent about one specific thing throughout his remarks. He said repeatedly that he is not rushing to judgment, and that the most serious possible charges, up to and including murder, should wait for actual evidence to materialize. He specifically identified the results of both autopsies, the state's examination and the independent one, as the single most critical missing piece in this entire case right now. He said that evidence, combined with the body itself being examined for signs of bruising or injury, alongside properly gathered witness statements in affidavit form, is what would actually need to come together before any judge could reasonably consider a warrant for something as serious as murder. He also walked through, in real detail, what happens procedurally even after an arrest, arraignment, bail decisions, a preliminary hearing, a possible grand jury indictment, and ultimately a trial requiring a unanimous jury verdict. His point in laying all of that out wasn't to build excitement toward an inevitable conviction. It was almost the opposite, to manage expectations. Even if an arrest happens in this case, he said, this would likely be a long process from there, with no guaranteed outcome at the end of it. He was candid, too, about the uncertainty built into that process. He noted that a hung jury is always a real possibility if jurors can't reach unanimous agreement, and that prosecutors would then have to decide whether to try the case again from scratch. He said, in essence, that even a completed trial doesn't necessarily guarantee a clean resolution, that the family may ultimately end up living with a verdict, whatever it turns out to be, rather than with the certainty they're searching for right now. Moore also raised broader, more institutional questions. He asked publicly whether the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, the FBI, or the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation should get involved, given his stated concerns about whether local law enforcement can conduct a fully unbiased investigation in this case. He didn't claim to know the answer. He said it's simply a fair question worth asking out loud. He also invoked the case of Emmett Till directly, noting that no one was ever held accountable for that killing despite what he described as overwhelming evidence at the time. He said he hopes, his word, that if the facts here do end up supporting charges, a jury in Mississippi today will give them fair and reasonable consideration. Moore was also personally direct about his own relationship with the state. He said he no longer refers to Mississippi as a great state, and said it's not a place he'd currently recommend anyone move to or raise a family in, citing what he described as deep-seated racial dynamics there. That kind of institutional skepticism, coming from a former judge with decades inside the system, isn't so different in substance from what drove hundreds of people to that corner of government and state streets over the weekend. The protesters and Moore are, in their own very different ways, pointing at the same underlying concern: whether this case will actually be investigated with the same seriousness it would receive if the circumstances were reversed. Let's be precise, one more time, about what Carlos Moore's commentary actually is and isn't, because I think that's the single most useful thing this episode can leave you with. His argument about potential theft of the phone is a genuine legal analysis, grounded in a specific piece of evidence that's already been publicly described, the video, and Nolan's own reported words on it. That argument stands on its own, independent of anything else in this case. His broader criticism of investigative pace, and his specific objection to the sheriff's early language around foul play are also reasoned opinions, informed by his real, first-hand experience signing these exact kinds of warrants himself. But his suggestion that the friend group should already be formally classified as suspects, and especially his open speculation about a specific parent potentially being an accessory, cross into a different category entirely. Those are exactly the kinds of claims that deserve to be labeled clearly, right now, as one person's suspicion, not treated as if they carry the same evidentiary weight as his more grounded legal reasoning about the phone. So where does that actually leave us? We have a community that showed up peacefully, several hundred strong by some counts, simply to say Nolan's name and ask that the truth be told, whatever it turns out to be. We have a former judge speaking publicly under his own name and real credentials, arguing there's already enough evidence for at least a narrow arrest related to the phone, and that broader investigative steps, warrants, subpoenas, formal interviews, should have already taken place by this point in the timeline. And we still have no released results from either autopsy, state, or independent, which Moore himself identifies as the single most important missing piece before anything more serious can move forward. What we don't have is confirmation of the more serious speculation about formal suspect status for anyone in the friend group, or about any specific individual's potential role beyond what's already been publicly described. Those remain, for now, exactly what they are, one credentialed person's opinion, offered publicly, worth taking seriously as legal analysis, without being mistaken for a finding of fact by an actual court. There's a real symmetry between the two halves of this case worth naming directly before we close. A crowd of ordinary people gathered on a street corner, not because they had legal training or inside knowledge, but because something about this case felt wrong enough to them that showing up in person mattered. A former judge, with decades of legal training and first-hand experience signing exactly these kinds of warrants, looked at the same set of facts and reached a similar conclusion, that the pace and posture of this investigation doesn't yet match its seriousness. Neither the protesters nor Moore have offered proof of what actually happened to Nolan Wells. What they've both offered, in their own very different ways, is a demand that the process itself move with the urgency this case deserves. We're going to keep following this case exactly the way we always have on this channel. The actual investigation, the pending autopsy results, and the facts as they're confirmed, not as they're speculated. When those autopsy results come back, we'll bring you what they actually say, not a rumor of what they say, and not what any of us assume they're going to say. That's the deal on this channel, and it's not changing for this case or any other. If today's episode is the first time you're hearing about Nolan Wells, go back and check the earlier coverage on this channel, because a lot of the details Moore references, the deleted accounts, the car keys, the timeline of that day, we walked through in more depth before this update. If you want to be here the moment those autopsy results actually drop, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because I promise you, when that information becomes public, it is not going to sit in my drafts for even a day. We move fast on this channel, but we move fast with the facts, not ahead of them. Thank you for spending this time with Nolan's story today. Say his name, ask for the truth, and I'll see you in the next update.